Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that I know a lot of you have been requesting, and it's one that I think is super relevant to how we're all living and connecting these days.
Yeah, with all the ways we can communicate now, it's kind of created this whole new landscape for relationships and intimacy.
Totally. So we're diving into the world of sexting.
Sexting.
We're going to try to understand how different cultures around the world view this whole digital form of intimacy.
Because it really does vary, doesn't it?
It does. And like getting into the nitty-gritty of is it just playful flirting in some places?
Right.
Or is it like a serious no-no?
A moral transgression.
Very
Big question.
Yeah. And then you get into like the legal stuff. Like, are there places where you can get in actual trouble even if everything's consensual?
Oh, yeah. It's a minefield out there.
Right. And then thinking about different communities, like how is the LGBTQ plus community using sexting?
Yeah, that's a really interesting area to look at.
Yeah. So we've got a ton to unpack. For this deep dive, we've got some really interesting research to pull from.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we've got studies on digital communication and sexuality.
Okay.
We've got some global studies on cultural attitudes,
Cool.
and even some insights into how specific online communities are kind of shaping the conversation around sexting.
This is exciting. I'm ready to dive in.
Okay, so
All
first
right.
things first, before we go globetrotting and all that, I think we need to define what exactly we mean by sexting.
Yes, good point. Because it can mean different things to different people.
Totally. So when we say sexting, what are we talking about?
At its core, we're talking about sending sexually explicit messages, images, or videos through digital devices.
Okay, so pretty much any kind of device that can send a text or a photo or, even like a video.
Exactly. Think text messages, social media direct messages on gaming platforms.
So basically any way you can communicate digitally.
Pretty much. But the thing is, even though the technology is pretty much universal, the way people interpret these actions, like the meanings they attach to it, and whether it's socially acceptable, that can be vastly different.
Got it. So we've got the technology, which is universal,
Right.
but then the cultural layer on top of that.
The cultural layer is huge. It's like different languages of sexting almost.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
But
So I'm already imagining like a spectrum here,
totally. Yeah.
like from cultures where it's like no big deal to, like you said, places where it's like, whoa, absolutely not.
Exactly. You got it. And there's so much in between, too.
Okay, so let's start maybe with what we might call Western cultures. So thinking like the US, Canada, a lot of Western Europe.
Sure. So in these places, research actually shows that sexting has become pretty common.
Interesting.
Yeah. Especially among young adults.
Okay, so that 18 to 30-ish range.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
And dating apps have definitely played a role in this trend, I'd say.
Yeah, I can see that. Like it's almost become part of the whole like modern dating script,
It's like the new normal. Swipe right, send a flirty message, maybe a suggestive photo.
Right. But then doesn't that normalization also create some pressure?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not all fun and games,
Yeah,
especially for young people who are navigating these spaces for the first time.
totally. It's like they're learning the rules as they go, and the stakes can feel really high.
Exactly. Because even in cultures where sexting is more accepted, it's definitely not without its complexities. We can't ignore issues like blurry lines around consent, privacy concerns, and the very real potential for abuse,
Yeah.
like revenge porn, which can have devastating impacts.
Right. And speaking of those darker sides of sexting, I feel like there's still this massive double standard when it comes to men and women.
Oh, huge double standard. You hit the nail on the head.
It's like women are judged so much more harshly, while men might even be, praised or seen as more, whatever, for the same behavior.
It's like they get a pat on the back for it almost.
It's so messed up.
It is. Unfortunately, those deep-rooted gender stereotypes, they persist even in digital spaces. And often women end up facing the brunt of the negative consequences.
While men's actions are often kind of brushed aside.
Exactly. Downplayed or even seen as like a sign of masculinity, which is just absurd.
Totally. It's like these societal power structures are just playing out online as well.
They seep into every aspect of our lives.
Yeah. And it's something we definitely need to keep talking about and challenging.
Sure.
Okay, so we've got this normalization of sexting in Western cultures, but with all these underlying social and ethical dilemmas that come with it. Now I'm really curious about the other end of the spectrum. What happens in cultures with more conservative values?
Yeah, like where religion plays a really significant role.
Exactly.
Okay, well, this is where we see like a huge contrast.
Okay.
Because in many parts of the world, sexting clashes directly with strong religious or traditional beliefs.
Makes sense.
So, for example, in regions where you have predominantly Islamic Hindu or even some Christian communities, sexting is often viewed as a serious transgression.
Wow.
It's not just about social disapproval either.
Wow.
It can actually have real legal consequences.
Oh, wow. So we're not just talking about like gossip or damage to your reputation.
Nope. This is serious stuff. We're
Yeah.
talking fines, imprisonment, even social ostracism in some cases.
Wow. And what kinds of legal penalties are we talking about specifically?
Well, the severity varies a lot depending on the specific country and the circumstances,
Okay.
but it can be really serious. This is especially true when it involves minors. Because even consensual sexting between minors can be treated as a serious offense.
Wow.
And a lot of these laws, they really reflect the underlying societal values. You know, they place a strong emphasis on modesty and premarital chastity.
So there's this real sense of like what's considered appropriate behavior.
Exactly. And it creates an environment where people are often afraid to even talk about sexting openly, which makes it even harder to address issues of consent and healthy relationships.
It's like a whole different conversation.
It is.
Yeah. So it's a good reminder that even though technology like connects us globally,
Yeah,
cultural values can shape our experiences in such different ways.
absolutely. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
That's definitely not.
Yeah.
Okay, so speaking of diverse experiences, I'm thinking about the LGBTQ plus community.
Right.
How does sexting play into their lives, especially in places where being openly queer is still dangerous or even illegal?
This is where things get really interesting and I think really important. Because for a lot of LGBTQ plus individuals, especially in countries with anti-LGBTQ plus laws or really strong social stigma, sexting can be a way to explore their identity and desires
Right.
in a space that feels safer than the offline world.
So it's like a digital safe haven almost.
It can be. And it offers a sense of anonymity and allows them to connect with others who share similar experiences.
So it's like this space where they can be themselves without fear of judgment or persecution. That's powerful.
It is. However, we can't pretend that there aren't risks. Even in more progressive societies, the LGBTQ plus community faces unique challenges when it comes to sexting.
Oh. Like what?
Well, there's always the risk of being outed without consent,
Oh, right.
facing discrimination based on leaked images, or encountering prejudice on platforms that maybe aren't specifically designed with inclusivity in mind.
So even when technology offers these new avenues for connection, it doesn't erase those very real vulnerabilities that marginalized communities face.
It's a double-edged sword, a lot of potential for good, but also potential for harm.
Yeah,
We have to acknowledge both sides.
absolutely. Okay, before we go too far down that path, there's one more area I want to explore.
Yeah.
What about online spaces where sexting is not only accepted, but it's almost like expected?
Oh, you mean like where it's part of the culture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like specific digital subcultures, gaming communities, platforms like OnlyFans.
Right.
What's happening there?
Well, in those spaces, you often find a much more open and accepting attitude towards sexting. It's kind of baked into the norms of the community.
So it's not just about individual desires, it's about what the community as a whole considers to be appropriate or even encouraged.
You got it. And in these spaces, anonymity can actually reduce stigma. And there's often a strong emphasis on consent and mutual desire.
So it's like creating a space where people feel more comfortable expressing themselves.
And exploring their sexuality.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that even in these spaces where sexting is more normalized, the potential for coercion, boundary violations, and exploitation still exists.
Right. It's like the digital world doesn't magically erase those risks.
Yep, it doesn't. And that actually brings us to the bigger picture here, this overarching theme. Sexting is never just a personal act.
It's so much more than that.
It really is. It's intertwined with cultural norms, legal frameworks, social anxieties, and I think our evolving understanding of what intimacy even means in this digital age.
So like what might seem like a simple text or photo is actually loaded with meaning and
Loaded.
potential consequence.
Exactly. Consequences we might not even be aware of.
Right.
And that's why it's crucial to understand the cultural context and be mindful of those potential risks and rewards.
And above all, prioritize consent, respect, and open communication in every interaction.
Always.
It's like we're all navigating this new terrain together,
We are.
figuring out the rules as we go.
Making it up as we go along.
Right.
Yeah. But with awareness and thoughtful consideration, we can make it a safer and more empowering experience for everyone.
Definitely. We've been talking about how cultural values and like all these social norms around the world shape how people experience and perceive sexting.
It's a global phenomenon, but very much localized too.
Totally. But I'm curious about the bigger picture, like how is sexting impacting the way we view intimacy itself in this digital age?
Ooh, that's a big one.
Right.
It's a fascinating question because it really forces us to rethink traditional ideas about intimacy. Because we tend to think of intimacy as requiring physical presence, right?
Like you have to be in the same room.
Exactly. But sexting creates this space where intimacy can be fostered through words, images, even emojis sent across the, vast distances.
So it's like we're developing a whole new language of intimacy.
Yeah.
One that's not bound by those physical limitations.
Exactly. A digital language of intimacy.
And that can be really amazing for people in long-distance relationships.
Right.
Or for folks who might not have access to traditional forms of intimacy because of disability or other circumstances.
Absolutely. It can be incredibly liberating.
Yeah.
It creates a sense of closeness and connection that might not otherwise be possible.
That's really cool. But it also presents new challenges too.
Yeah.
Right?
Of course. There's always another side of the coin.
Like how do you build trust, establish boundaries, and ensure safety when you're interacting purely through screens?
Right. It's like, how do you translate those essential elements of intimacy into the digital realm?
It's a whole new set of skills we have to learn.
Totally. And it's a delicate balance. It requires a lot of thoughtfulness and communication.
Like we're still figuring out the etiquette.
The unspoken rules of the game.
Right.
And that's where open and honest communication becomes absolutely crucial.
I was just going to say that. Like you have to talk about it.
You have to. You have to be willing to have conversations about expectations, boundaries, what feels comfortable for each person, and really listen to your partner. Respect their needs and limits.
And those conversations can be tricky, right?
They can be, because you're talking about something so personal and potentially vulnerable.
Totally. Like it's not always easy to articulate those desires and boundaries.
Yeah,
Especially if you're worried about judgment or rejection.
I hear you.
Yeah.
But it's so important to approach those conversations with empathy, respect, and a willingness to be vulnerable ourselves.
Like lead by example.
Exactly. Think about it this way. By creating a space where both partners feel safe to express themselves honestly, you're actually laying the foundation for a stronger and more fulfilling relationship, whether it's online or offline.
So it's not about the technology itself. It's about using that technology to build healthier connections.
Yes, to deepen those connections.
And speaking of connections, I'm curious about how sexting impacts not just romantic relationships, but other kinds of relationships too.
Oh, interesting. Like, what are you thinking?
Well, we've been focusing a lot on dating and romantic partners, but sexting happens in friendships, in casual hookups, in polyamorous relationships.
Right. It's like this whole other layer of communication that's woven into how we connect with others, not just romantic others.
Exactly. It's like this extra dimension. So like sexting can be a way for long-term couples to keep things exciting.
Just spice things up.
Right. Or for friends to explore a different dynamic in their relationship.
Yeah, it can add a new layer of intimacy and connection.
And it can also be a way for people to explore their sexuality in a safe and private way.
Without necessarily committing to a physical encounter.
Exactly. But no matter what the relationship dynamic is, it all comes back to that core principle of consent.
Always. Consent is non-negotiable. And it's not just a one-time yes or no.
Right.
It's an ongoing process, a continuous check-in to make sure that everyone feels safe, respected, and empowered throughout the interaction.
And what if something feels off?
If someone is pressuring you to do something you're not comfortable with, you always have the right to say no, to block them, to report them if necessary. Trust your instincts and prioritize your own well-being.
It's like we're constantly learning, adapting, and evolving the language of intimacy as technology changes and those cultural norms shift.
The digital landscape is constantly changing. We have to keep up.
Which makes me wonder, what might the future hold for sexting and digital intimacy?
Ooh, good question. What's next?
Like what new technologies or platforms might pop up in the next few years, and how will they shape the way we connect?
Oh, I love thinking about the future. It's so exciting. We're kind of on the verge of a whole new era of human connection, and sexting is just one piece of that puzzle. We're seeing the rise of virtual reality, augmented reality, even artificial intelligence. And all of that has the potential to transform the way we experience intimacy. I think it's an opportunity to explore new possibilities, challenge those outdated norms, and create a more inclusive and understanding approach to intimacy in all its forms.
That's an inspiring way to look at it. But before we get too carried away with futuristic visions,
Hmm.
I think it'd be helpful to bring things back down to earth a bit.
Back to reality.
Right. So what are some practical steps that our listeners can take right now to navigate the world of sexting safely and respectfully?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll dive into right after this.
Welcome back. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from cultural attitudes to the evolving nature of intimacy in the digital age.
We've been all over the map, haven't we?
We have. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to get practical. What are some tangible takeaways our listeners can use to navigate this world of sexting responsibly and safely?
Yeah, great point. All this information is super interesting, but it's most valuable when we can actually apply it to our own lives.
Totally. So let's distill some actionable advice.
Okay, so first things first. We gotta remember that everything we do online leaves a trace.
Like a digital footprint.
Exactly. That suggestive photo, that flirty text message.
It doesn't just disappear into the ether.
Nope. It can be saved, shared, or even end up in places you never intended. So it's super important to think before you send. Consider those potential consequences, not just for yourself, but for the other person too.
And of course, we can't emphasize enough the importance of consent.
It really is the foundation of any healthy interaction, online or offline. Make sure you have clear and enthusiastic consent from the other person before sending anything explicit. And remember, consent can be withdrawn at any time. It's not a one-time thing.
So basically, open and ongoing communication is key.
Absolutely. Talk about your boundaries, your expectations, what you're comfortable with, and really listen to what the other person is saying, too. It's a two-way street.
And if something feels off, like if someone's pressuring you or making you uncomfortable,
trust your instincts. You have the right to say no, to disengage, to block someone, or even report them if necessary. There are resources available if you need help, like the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. They specifically support victims of online harassment and non-consensual image sharing. Remember, you're not alone, and you don't have to go through this alone.
So we've talked about, caution, consent, potential risks.
Yeah.
But sexting can also be a positive and empowering experience, right?
Oh, absolutely. It can be a fun, playful, and intimate way to connect with a partner, explore desires, and keep the spark alive in a relationship.
So how do we balance those positive aspects with the potential risks? How do we make sure that sexting remains a healthy and enjoyable experience for everyone involved?
I think it comes back to communication, respect, and establishing those clear boundaries. Talk to your partner, be honest about your desires and your limits, and create a dynamic where both of you feel safe, comfortable, and empowered.
It's fascinating to think that our understanding of intimacy is constantly evolving right alongside technology.
It's true.
What might be considered taboo today could be totally commonplace in the future.
Definitely. The key is to stay informed, be open to new possibilities, but always with a focus on well-being and respect. Ultimately, intimacy in all its forms should be about connection, pleasure, and mutual trust.
So as we venture into this kind of uncharted territory of digital intimacy,
Yeah.
let's do so with awareness, respect, and a healthy dose of self-awareness.
Well said. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay connected.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into sexting around the world. Thanks for joining us.